Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, before I introduce my guest this week, just a polite reminder, please do subscribe, won't you? Our subscriptions have been going up and up and up recently, but we don't want to be complacent about it. So please do. It's totally free, as you must know by now. And once you've done that, if you go next door, you'll see there's another little bell sign, and that tells you how to get notifications. So do that and join the thousands who are already doing it. Now, you will be very aware from what we talk about on this channel that, frankly, all of our public discourse now, particularly about history, is dominated by the narrative of a rancidly racist, greedy and violent empire. Now, to challenge any of that narrative takes a lot of courage. In fact, one often doesn't see it that much. But I'm very pleased to say that my guest today is one such writer. Regius Professor Emeritus of Pastoral and Moral Theology at Oxford, Nigel Biggar. Thank you very much for coming, Nigel.
Thanks for inviting me back.
Yes, of course, because this is your second visit, isn't it? The book we're talking about is Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. It's already a bestseller. I couldn't recommend it more. Before we talk about the subjects in the book, Nigel, this almost didn't see the light of day, isn't that right?
That's right. That's right. I was commissioned to write it in 2018 by Bloomsbury Publishing, and I produced a manuscript at the end of 2020. My editor loved it. He said it was an important book. He reckoned it might sell up to 20,000 copies, but 3 months later, the top of Bloomsbury sent me an email saying, we're going to postpone publication indefinitely. But I wasn't willing to let them go that easily, so I pressed them gently in a couple of emails saying, which public feeling are you referring to? Because there are many public feelings. Yeah. And when might it be favourable to publish in your view? And we had a couple of exchanges by email, and they didn't answer my questions, but apparently, in spite of not being able to tell me which public feeling they were worried about, they announced that they were going to return my contract.
But you did actually get another publisher?
Yeah, eventually, yes. I mean, I spent several £100 on a lawyer to try and see if I could hold Bloomsbury to their contract, to discover that there was a clause in it that let them out. But then, happily, about 2 months later, I was able to sign a contract with William Collins, which is an imprint of HarperCollins.
Right.
And they brought the book out 2 weeks ago.
Right. I mean, it is, as I said in the introduction there, it is unusual, is it not, to actually see even the most nuanced argument saying that perhaps imperialism and the British Empire in particular were not necessarily all motivated by evil. What I want to start by asking you actually is that at the very beginning, you talk about why you wanted to write this book. I'm just going to read it if I can. I think it's very good. We're talking about the current time. What is at stake at the moment is not merely the pedantic truth about yesterday, but the self-perception and self-confidence of the British today and the way they conduct themselves in the world tomorrow. What is also at stake, therefore, is the very integrity of the United Kingdom and the security of the West. That is why I have written this book. Now, that seems to be a noble motive. Can you expand on that for us?
Yes. There were 2 stimuli for my writing the book in the first place. I'm both English and Scottish. I was born in Scotland, educated in England. I identify myself as British, so I'm committed to the United Kingdom and keeping the UK united. So I've always been an opponent of Scottish separatism. And I noticed when reading certain Scottish nationalists in and around the 2014 referendum that some of them thought of or think of Scottish separation from the UK, Scottish independence, as a kind of national self-purification of Scotland from Britain, and Britain equals empire equals evil. And so my contribution to combating the feelings that generate support for Scottish independence was to push back against that travesty of Britain's imperial history, and that's why one reason I wrote that book. But more generally, I observed that, as is evident, and you'll know this, at the moment, although there's much talk about empire and colonialism, no one cares about the Arab empires of the medieval period, or African empires, the Zulu Empire or the Comanche Empire in the southwest of North America, or the Chinese Empire. No one cares about non-white empires or non-European empires. So what's the obsession? Why the obsession with European empires, and especially the British? And it's my reading is this is an assault on the record of the West.
So it's almost by proxy. So this kind of assault on the empire academically is actually really about the West today.
Yes, and it's our equivalent of the assault on the foundations of the United States. So in the United States, there is this 1619 project, whose claim is that the very foundations of the United States are racist, and therefore the American project is from the beginning morally vicious and illegitimate. So the debate over colonialism here is our equivalent to that.
Are you surprised? I mean, why do you think this has sort of blown up in the past, 3 years? I'm not saying there hasn't always been this narrative, but in the past 3 years, particularly in America, with the 1619 project, as you just mentioned, it's gone at this extraordinary speed, it seems to me. Why?
So two things. I think social media, of course, brings ideas from the margins to the centre very quickly, and they just spread. And insofar as institutions care about what goes on social media, these movements that expand through social media can become quite powerful. So there's that. But the other thing is, we had the adumbration, the kind of the heralding of the current mood when the Rhodes Must Fall campaign arrived in Britain from South Africa in 2015-16. And then what happened was the killing of George Floyd in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was an American movement, suddenly landed over here, and various activist groups on the left promoted it as if the UK were the US. So it's as if whatever problems the US suffers from in terms of race and in terms of their fundamentally racist society is equally true of us. So if you put together social media, the political interest of activist groups exploiting Black Lives Matter, combined with widespread ignorance, even among educated, degree-holding citizens in Britain, people who run institutions, widespread ignorance of our imperial history. No one knows enough to contradict the radically negative narrative. And that's one reason I wrote the book. At least, if no one agrees with my argument, at least in the pages of my book they will discover the whole truth. The good and the bad and the good about our imperial past.
You see, that seems to be key to me, that in fact, people just simply don't know. They don't know the facts. They don't know, even if they want to, come to a conclusion which is not the same as mine or yours or whatever, they simply don't know the facts. And you do come across people now, younger people particularly, who seriously think that slavery was a uniquely British thing, for example.
Yes.
That even colonialism was a British thing. Because although the British Empire features in your book, it's actually about imperialism, isn't it, generally? I'm intrigued. The title is A Moral Reckoning, and that ethics is your field, isn't it? So how does that differ from being an historical reckoning?
Right. So as you say, I'm an ethicist, so I'm in the business of analysing issues and coming to a moral judgment about them. That's my trade, that's my profession. And so what I've tried to do is to, in the course of my career I have worked on the ethics of war, for example, so I've tried to come to judgments about various wars, present and past. And so I tried something more ambitious here to reach a moral judgment, an overall moral judgment about the phenomenon of empire and the particular phenomenon of one empire, namely the British. Now, lots of my critics, particularly on the far left, point out that Biggar is not an historian, and so Biggar really has no authority to speak about these matters. To which my swift response is, well, no, and you're not ethicists, and yet apparently you've got very strong moral views about the past. The book is organised. It's not a history of the British Empire. It's organised according to moral issues like racism and violence and economic issues and cultural assimilation, that kind of thing. So it's organised in terms of moral issue. But obviously I have to try and get the historical facts straight, so I know what I'm judging. And so I've taken care, particularly when dealing with issues I know are controversial, to read more than one historian. As you'll see at the beginning of the book, there are about 10 pre-publication commendations by historians, so many professional historians reckon I've done a decent job, although I'm quite sure that given the vastness of the territory in terms of geographical extent from British Columbia to New Zealand, and in terms of time from 1600 to 1960, there will be mistakes in there. But several historians who've read the text reckon it's a pretty balanced and fair judgment.
I've never seen so many notes, actually, I have to say. It's go on for pages.
I had to cover my rear end. But also, I decided to spare the reader some of my skirmishes with my critics.
Right.
But there's some good stuff in the notes.
Actually, speaking of your skirmishes with critics, in some ways, you sort of found is it right to say, actually, you sort of found yourself in this position? Because you wrote a piece, didn't you, for the Times? This would have been 2015, I think?
17.
17?
Yep.
So, basically before the Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Talking about how, look, it's a more nuanced picture. There was good and bad in everything, and that includes the British Empire. And basically the roof came down on you, didn't it?
That's right. So this was December 17. In July of that year, I'd launched a research project called Ethics and Empire, which was designed to look at empires from ancient China to the modern period and look at how contemporaries viewed empire in moral terms. So this was nothing to do with defending British Empire. But then, you're right, in November of 2017 I published an article in the Times arguing that we British can find cause for both shame and pride in our imperial past. And it was a week or two later that Dr. Priyamvada Gopal from Cambridge University tweeted to her allies, her political allies in Oxford, OMG, oh my God, this is serious, SHIT, we must block capitals, shut this down, is what she tweeted.
Gopal?
Gopal, yeah. Which, looking back, betrayed more than a hint of panic, frankly. Yeah. But at the time, no, I was completely innocent. I didn't know what had hit me. And then in the space of 1 week, there were 3 online mass denunciations, the last 2 by sets of academics. And my main collaborator on the Ethics and Empire project, who is arguably the preeminent historian of empire writing in English, he jumped ship within 4 days. So really? the project was severely damaged at that point. But happily again, in the course of the next 12 months, we recovered, and we've had 4 conferences since. About over 40 historians have taken part in in our various conferences, in spite of the fact that the Oxford Centre for Global History has continued to boycott us.
Really?
Yeah. So we're having the final the final conference this coming June.
How does it? How do you feel about that as an academic? I mean, do you get very anxious about it? I mean, when you've been under that kind of, pressure of criticism.
Well, when I first fell into it, I was very anxious about it. I didn't know what had hit me. I had some close friends who said, "You must drop this project because it's just too toxic." So I did wonder whether I was daft. And I didn't know. I mean, although I was then a senior, well-established academic, I wasn't sure whether my project and my reputation would survive. And I was, most of all, I think I was just dismayed and perplexed at the behaviour of fellow academics, some of them in my own university. The aggression, and I mean, now I'm used to it. I'm aware that there are people out there who are determined to attack me and people like me, who are not going to be fair, and who don't really want a conversation. And one thing I've learned is, if people don't want a conversation, and they usually betray it by being aggressive and provocative, I just don't engage with them. There's no point. But there is a problem with some academics who are very aggressive and who will not listen. And I'm sure there are respects in which I deserve to be corrected in a kind of give and take exchange of reasons. But that's not the mood that possesses a lot of these folk. Most of them are younger. So I won't say it's all historians. But the other thing I've learnt is that there is an aggressive, zealous minority. There's a much larger number of academics who don't like trouble, who don't like conflict, and who just keep quiet.
Well, you see, I think a majority of people, public, not just the reading public, increasingly keep quiet because of they fear what might happen to them, and it's a kind of it's an appalling atmosphere that we're living in at the moment, I think, generally. But I think that, commonsensically they would see, well, actually, yes, there must have been good and bad things about the British Empire. I feel that they would feel that,
Yeah, and they do. I mean, the fact this book, within 2 weeks, is number 10 in the Sunday Times bestseller list, I'm told. We'll have to see it on Sunday. I mean, that tells us that there is a very large appetite for what other people have described as a balanced, fair treatment of the past. And I'm not pessimistic about the future, Peter, because my consistent experience and observation has been that there is a silent, cowed, uncertain majority out there who, under the right conditions, will speak their minds. I mean, I was very encouraged a couple of years ago. There was an occasion in Cambridge University where the university, at the top of the university, wanted to pass a regulation that would require all members of the university to respect the opinions of other people. And a colleague, a friend of mine in Cambridge, Arif Ahmed, who's an atheist philosopher, thought to himself, he said, well, you can ask me to tolerate views I think are nonsense. Don't ask me to respect things I think are nonsense. And so he decided to mount a counteraction, and that required a debate to be held in the university assembly to which all academics belong. In order to get a debate going, he had to put down a motion. In order to propose a motion, he had to get, I think, 25 signatures. It took him weeks to get 25 academics with the courage to put their names to this motion, even though many said to him, we agree with what you're doing, we're grateful that you're doing that, but we're not going to sign this. But here's the thing, he got his motion, it was debated, a vote was held, and the university proposal failed by 4-1.
Really?
But here's the other thing, the reason for that was the vote was by secret ballot. So the bad news is people are still scared, too scared to say what they think, even in our universities, and that's really bad news. The good news is, under the right conditions, there are plenty of sensible people out there who will rise, but we've got to create the conditions where they feel free to do that.
Well, you know, we get so many letters and emails and comments from people who feel very much, well, bewildered and beleaguered, particularly when it comes to the kind of, well, I say decimation of their history. And, you know, they don't feel equipped to say it. I just wanted to ask you some questions based on the chapters, which are, as you say, they're very much, you know, they're sort of very much in the sort of sense of philosophical questions. It's not chronological as such, is it? I mean, so, for example, if someone to say, well, I'm, you know, my friend here, or my neighbour is constantly saying that the British Empire was built on nothing but violence and racism. What can I say to that?
Okay.
I know, look, it's extremely detailed in here. I'm just asking you to summarise. I mean, I should say, by the way, it's this incredibly detailed book, but as it should indeed be.
Is it incredibly what?
Detailed.
Oh, right, okay, good. I hope it's readable.
Oh, no, it absolutely is. But I mean, the fact is, people need to be, you know, acquainted with the facts.
Yeah, fine.
But what would you say in that situation? Somebody's arguing, and this is an argument that happens all the time now.
Yeah, and so the phrase colonialism and slavery is now common, as if the two things were the same thing. So one easy way to counter that simplistic reduction of British Empire to racism and violence is to say, from 1807, when the British abolished the slave trade within their territories, and then 1833, when they abolished slavery throughout the British Empire, and thereafter, when the British suppressed slavery across the Atlantic, across Africa to Malaysia, they did so in the name of a largely Christian, partly Enlightenment conviction that all human beings, regardless of race and regardless of cultural development, are basically equal under God. Right? So a lot of imperial endeavour from the early 19th century onwards was motivated by a fundamental conviction of human equality, anti-racist, anti-slavery. So you've got that. And then, yes, the British Empire was often violent, and sometimes the violence was illegitimate. In the book, for example, I say the opium wars of the 1840s against the Qing Empire in China were, I think, unjustified. And there are other instances there too. The infamous massacre at Amritsar in 1919, for example. But then I say the British Empire was at its most violent when? Between 1939 and 1945, and between May 1940, after France had fallen, and before June 1941, when Hitler was unwise enough to invade Soviet Russia. In that 12-month period, the British Empire offered the only military resistance to the massively murderous, racist empire based in Berlin, with the sole exception of Greece. So yes, it was violent, but sometimes violence is justified, and it wasn't always unjustified violence. Yes. So those are two things. There's a lot more detail I could put in there, but those are two major events and policies of the British Empire that tell against the simplistic reduction.
What about the other simplistic reduction, maybe, which is that it was based entirely on sort of capitalistic greed, all about money?
Yes, okay. Well, the empire often began with trade. So the East India Company was a trading company, and it set up, it negotiated the use of ports in India, and the East India Company was in the business of making money. and speaking for myself, I'm not a Marxist. I see nothing wrong with making money. There are good and bad ways of doing it, of course, but nothing wrong with making money. So what happened in India was that the company traded with Indian merchants, and there was a breakdown of law and order away from the coast, and this disrupted trade, and so the East India Company ended up allying itself with certain Indian parties in order to beat their enemies, and as a reward the company was granted lands and sometimes even ports. So it started with trade and then grew into issues to do with security, and eventually the East India Company ended up governing parts of India. But as the Bengal-born and now LSE-based economic historian Tirthankar Roy will say, the alliance between Indians and British was often by choice.
Yes.
In certain circumstances, Indians, particularly Indian merchants, preferred British rule to what else was on offer. And British rule was never simply us on top of them. It was us cooperating with them to create a political environment that served everyone's interests.
Do you have any truck with the idea that again that somehow in the general pantheon of empires, the British Empire was actually quite a benign one?
Yeah, well, certainly it'd be easy to compare the British Empire to the imperial expansion of Genghis Khan, for example.
Yep.
Who I believe after when he besieged cities tended to slaughter everybody and create pyramids of skulls just to make a certain point. So yes, I do think insofar as the British Empire was motivated by humanitarian concerns, and so the concern to suppress slavery was one of those. British officials in Australia and North America were often very distressed at the plight of native Australians and native Americans, particularly because of the inadvertent impact of disease.
Yes.
Europeans brought diseases to Australia and North America against which native peoples were not immunized. This wasn't deliberate, but the British officials were often distraught to observe the devastation that was to which native peoples were subject, and they sought to ameliorate both that, and they were aware that conflict between settlers and natives was often brutal, and the natives were often dealt with unjustly, and they sought to control it. So there certainly were significant humanitarian strands, and also there was a liberal political strand that you can see when you observe the fact that, yes, the British lost the American colonies because we tried to hang on to them too tightly, but we learnt from that, and as a consequence, from the 1860s onwards, Canada, Australia, South Africa and New Zealand become increasingly autonomous and independent, so that by 1930 each of those is virtually an independent state.
They're dominions, aren't they?
The dominions, that's right. And even by the 1920s, India was set on the same path. So we were sufficiently liberal politically that we recognised that if the empire was to survive at all, it would have to evolve into an alliance of culturally and politically similar and allied nations, independent states.
What do you see looking to the future? I mean, apart from reading your book, what can people do? When you look at the younger generation who know nothing about it, but also have very strong views now because of what they've been taught, how on earth do we rebalance that?
Well, it's going to take time, and it's going to take, I think, often people are in institutions, and the institutions are led by certain people. And right now, a lot of our cultural institutions are dominated by the narrative that colonialism equals slavery equals racism.
Yes.
So I think what needs to happen is actually that narrative needs to be dislodged from our institutions, and it's going to take time. But the good news, Peter, is that there are movements of resistance that have grown up in the last 30, 40 months. For example, within the National Trust, we've got Restore Trust. We've got History Reclaimed that has about 40 historians who write for it. Although Bloomsbury did counsel my book, it's been published.
Yes.
And look at the popularity of it. So in time, I hope this phase whereby the BLM narrative about Britain being systemically racist, which I think is patently untrue, and our recent imperial history being a litany of racism and oppression and disproportionate violence, that will become increasingly questioned, and my book will make a contribution to that, I hope.
Absolutely. It's a sort of generational thing, really, isn't it? It's going to take quite a long time.
I think that's right.
Right. At the end, you do have, as it were, well, you make a moral reckoning. You know, you evaluate. You know, but I don't know quite how one does that. But you know, what was the conclusion you came to?
Well, let me tell you how I tried to do it.
Yeah.
Because in the conclusion, having surveyed the history of the British Empire, I say, well, here's a list of all the bad things, all the evils. And by evils, I don't just mean deliberate wrongs. I also mean evils like inadvertent disease, okay, and famine that we didn't manage to deal with very well. And then here are the benefits, the good things. And I say, you know, there's no rational way of saying this weighs more heavily than that. So we can't say that the benefit of the rule of law weighs more heavily than 150 years of slavery.
Yes.
I mean, you just can't compare the two. Can't do it that way. What you can do is you can say, well, was there something in the British Empire at its very heart that was essentially, centrally, crucially evil? Now we do say that about the Nazi Empire. So you know, Adolf Hitler built autobahns, which was good. Mussolini made the trains around time in Italy, which was good. But we don't think that compensates in any way for as I put it before, the massively murderous, racist heart of the Nazi regime. So can we say that the British Empire was of that kind? And this is what the radical anti-colonialists are trying to tell us. They're trying to tell us that the British Empire was equivalent to Nazism, that Churchill was like Hitler, and that we committed genocide like the Holocaust. So one conclusion I come to, and the reader can make up his own mind as to whether this is a cogent conclusion, is that there was nothing in the British Empire approximate to Nazism, nothing at all. So I clear that charge aside. And then I say, well, in addition to that, there were persistent humanitarian and liberal strands in the empire. And then look at the way the empire died. So the empire exhausted itself in 1939 to 45. Churchill did not have to take us to keep us in the war against Hitler in May 1940. We could have negotiated an agreement with Hitler. Hitler would probably have let us keep the empire.
Yes.
But Churchill rightly put both Britain and the empire at risk for the sake of opposing this murderous, racist challenge to liberal, humane Christian civilization. He was right to do that, and the empire exhausted itself in fighting that. So that has to say something good about what the empire had become.
Also, it basically let itself go very easily, didn't it? I mean, people just, there was no fight, it was accepted, the decolonisation process, the real one, that happened over 30, 40 years in the post-war years, was very easy.
Well, it's not entirely true. I mean, there were disturbances, the Mau Mau disturbances in Kenya, but that wasn't essentially an independence movement. There were particular reasons for that, which I try to explain. But yes, I mean, decolonisation, the 50s and 60s, Britain, I think, accepted that, apart from the fact that we were bankrupt after the Second World War, and we had no stomach for holding on to these things, and we also accepted that once there was a widespread mass movement calling for independence, we were not prepared to shed blood on a massive scale to stop it. So we tried to navigate independence as best we could. Many people then, particularly with regard to Africa, thought we were decolonising too quickly, and I think a lot of people now, looking back, even those who supported independence, might well think the same thing. But given our condition in the 1950s and early 60s, it would have been difficult to impossible, and probably not right to hang on to the colonies.
But you are, broadly speaking, when it comes to the whole way in which we treat our history, broadly optimistic, you say, for the future, even though it might take...
Well, yes, I'm optimistic, partly for the reason I said. I mean, there are signs that resistance has begun to gather steam. There's clearly a market for reasonable views. And the other reason I'm optimistic, Peter, is that in the last 5 years I've had reason to look at what my critics say, and the number of passages in the book which you'll have read where I decide to expose the weakness of, for example, Dan Hicks' account of what happened in Benin in 1897, or Hilary Beckles' argument that Britain should pay reparations. So I deliberately dismantle these arguments just to show the weakness of them. Every time I encounter my critics, I come away thinking they're wrong. They're just wrong.
Yes.
And I do know that truth and reason don't always triumph in political life, but it does make me feel on a strong footing that the nakedness of these anti-colonialist emperors can be exposed.
Yes. Well, this is a great start, if not a landmark. Colonialism and Moral Reckoning, there by Nigel Biggar. It's available obviously in Amazon and shops.
For sure.
On the Watersons and everything. Yeah. Thank you very, very much indeed for coming on, Nigel.
I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
And all the very best. And I hope it's number one on the list in a few weeks' time.
Me too.
Thank you. Thank you. That's it for this week. We shall see you next time on So What You're Saying Is. Thank you. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.